in one.
This is amazing. Wow. Well, first of all, my name is Gunnar. I'm the proud director of the Environment for Development initiative. I would like to just take a few seconds now at the beginning of this first seminar in the new EfD seminar series to just welcome you all, and also a big hand to Alejandro, who has been conceiving of this. And not only that, we've been talking about this for a long, long time, and now it's actually happening. So thank you so much, Alejandro. Just a few words. Of course, much of our focus over the last 18 years or so has been to create vibrant research environments. And one thing that we have really encouraged is to have a very active seminar series in each and every one of the centers. But with the proliferation of our collaborative programs, that has become even, a more vibrant area for interaction between researchers throughout our global network to work together. And some, of course, for example, SETI has had a very active, activity for their own sake with their own seminars, but we feel that there is a great opportunity to do this jointly for the whole network. And Alejandro's vision for this is to, in particular, feature the collaborative programs. So in the first round now, our various collaborative programs will be featured during these seminars. But I am so happy that so many of you have found your way to this first virtual seminar. I know that there are many around, so we're very happy that you joined this particular one. But also to spread the word and also think about your own work, if that could be featured in future seminars, or there will also be another series that will be more, work in progress. But this is the first seminar in our kind of high-level seminar series where it's featuring more finished work. And today, we have the great opportunity to feature our most prolific collaborative program, which is the Sustainable Energy Transition Initiative. So I leave it over to Marcela, who is coordinating that global collaborative program, to be the chair for today's session and introduce the speaker. So Marcela, over to you, and thanks once again, all of you, for joining today.
Well, good afternoon and morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be invited to moderate our first EfD Global Seminar, and also to introduce our very first speaker. Today, we will be listening to Marc Jeuland's presentation. Marc is an associate professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at the Duke Global Health Institute at Duke University. She's also the co-lead at the James E. Rogers Energy Access Project at Duke. And along with that, Marc has played a very important role in the EfD network. Together with Sobrendo Patanajak, they initiated what is today the Sustainable Energy Transitions Initiative, which we are very proud of. And as of today, he is the staff leader of our collaborative program. Marc will be presenting today the paper titled Time Money Trade-offs and the Value of Time that Women Spend Obtaining Firewood. And as general instruction for the assistants, Marc will have 40 minutes for each presentation. I want to make a major correction. I was told in the chat that Marc is now a full professor. So congratulations, Marc. Well, So Marc will have 40 minutes for presentation, and then this will follow by questions by the public. So to make the very best of this interaction, I kindly ask you to write your questions in the chat. And then at the end of Marc's presentation, we will have some time for a broader interactions. So having said so, very welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Marcela. I trust everyone can hear me, and let me try sharing my screen now. Marcela, can you confirm that that's up?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so very happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation to do this inaugural seminar. I feel quite honored to have that position, and hopefully I'll do it justice and create some momentum for the future ones. So this paper that I'm going to present here has largely been the product of collaboration with a PhD student, Ryan McCord at Duke, but behind it, there's a much larger multi-country SETI team. So it's sort of the perfect thing to perhaps feature in this inaugural session. So this is really a SETI story. Oops, that's a malfunction. It's not this type of SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's actually this SETI, which is the Sustainable Energy Transitions Initiative, where we have a collaborative research strategy that this paper is actually going to touch on in several different ways. And the particular partners in this project include EfD Center in Kenya, as well as Tanzania, some other SETI partners who are not in EfD centers in Zambia and Malawi, many students in all of these different places, as well as Sequest Capital and the Clean Cooking Alliance, who are sort of funding the work. The intervention around this project is largely implemented or financed by Sequest Capital. So it's sort of studying their cook stove development model. And so it's going to touch on, a number of different aspects that relate to SETI's research strategy, one of which is lack of access to modern fuels. Another which has to do with women's empowerment as it relates to energy. Gaps in research, because I'm going to be talking about the value of time in the context of firewood collection, and we don't actually have that many estimates that come from this specific domain. And then sort of thinking about the connection between research and policy, because the motivation behind trying to estimate this value of time is to inform policy implementation and policy interventions that would help alleviate some of the energy poverty burdens that we're talking about. So I'm going to do a brief synopsis here, just in case I run out of time, because I want to leave time for questions at the end, and there's a lot to cover. You'll see that this is sort of a complex study with several different moving parts. So what's the research question? Mainly, we're going to be after what the value of time is that rural households spend gathering fuel. And in the sample that I'm going to be presenting on, this is mainly women. So that's an important contextual feature of this. Question, why do this? Because we actually need to know something about these time burdens if we're really doing full social cost benefit analysis. And it turns out that those time benefits could be quite large, depending on how you read the literature and sort of what the type of intervention is. It also relates to an important household internality. And so what I mean here is that within the household, this should, it should be something that they consider privately when deciding to adopt a clean technology. But bargaining power within the household varies quite a lot. And so if the people who are bearing these burdens don't have decision-making power in particular, this might be undervalued even within the household at the private level. And so, this is an important input to benefit cost analysis of a variety of different types of interventions that could address the problem. I'm going to apply two types of non-market valuation methods, both revealed and stated preferences. The revealed preference analysis is going to focus on variation in households' decision to purchase or collect wood fuel. And the stated preference decisions are going to be hypothetical trade-offs that households or respondents in this particular case make across different options that have different cost and time aspects and attributes, as well as other characteristics. So the main results are that the value of time that we derive is ranging from about 20% to 100% of the average wage rate in the sample. This varies within and across countries and also across methods and specifications, but largely in that range. And in addition to the value of time, we can also see how these decisions to purchase versus collect fuel are correlated with other household and respondent characteristics, which meaningfully reflect their constraints and opportunities. And here I'll be emphasizing a lot some of the constraints on women's agency and decision-making power. Okay, so here's the outline for the rest of my presentation. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on motivation, but I may skip through as I watch the time because I'm sure you all want to know much more about the results as well. So beginning with this motivation, when we think about the household costs of energy poverty, much of the focus in the literature, really the dominant focus, has been on the environmental health burden of this. Okay, so this is clearly motivated by the fact that the big picture here is that 23% of global mortality is somehow attributable to the environmental factors. Much of this is concentrated in the global south, where pollution harms tend to be greater. And about 3 million of these total deaths, which you can see by region in this sort of chart, occur because of household air pollution in some form or another, either directly indoors or because of the household air pollution's contribution to ambient air pollution. So that's linked to many of these environmental conditions that are on the right-hand side of the slide, in particular the ones that I've highlighted here, some of which are acute illnesses that occur mainly in young children, but also some that are chronic diseases that occur over the life course once exposures have accumulated over time. But environmental health costs are just one of these costs of energy poverty. When households rely on biomass fuels to meet their energy needs, they also end up spending a lot of time collecting firewood and processing that firewood or biomass to be used in often inefficient cooking technology. And all of that inefficiency sort of increases the time burdens further. Moreover, this is highly gendered. It's defined by cultural norms and expectations for who plays what role within the household. And even if the people who are bearing these costs wanted to change this, they may not be able to because they don't have control over financial decisions. Estimates from representative multi-tier framework surveys from the World Bank in several sub-Saharan African countries range from 3 hours to 4 hours per day in terms of these time costs for all of the collection plus the cooking plus the processing of fuels. But that's a lot of time. And because women are doing most of this work, they also bear a lot of the health costs because they're more exposed to the health pollution, as well as the people young kids that they often take care of in these households. So therefore, household energy interventions aimed at reducing the amount of biomass needed and sort of increasing the efficiency of a cook stove have the potential to deliver really significant time savings. We, as SETI, did a large systematic review some time back. And in that review, we sort of tracked how energy technologies and interventions can be linked to a variety of different impacts. Looking at household scale, firm scale, all the way up to national and environmental scales. And the figure that I'm showing here from sort of the summary of the statistical studies shows in each of these kind of blue colored wedges, the share of studies under different kinds of categories. And you can see, consistent with that sort of dominant narrative in the literature, that health and air quality are sort of like the big focal areas for energy intervention impacts. If we look at time use, it's a much smaller sliver of these total numbers of studies. And on the outer ring, you can sort of see, like with this colored shading with the gold and yellow, is sort of positive impacts of an energy intervention on these outcomes. Positive meaning good from the household perspective. And you can see that time use, sort of, you often have time savings, although there's some ambiguity in some of these studies as well. And then if you look at gender equality within this whole set of studies, it's also a relatively small sliver of the pie. So these are both sort of important research gaps relative to the much more studied health concerns. This was another sort of study done by a colleague, Krishna Priya, and us at Duke, where we tried to look at the literature and studies that have estimated time savings specifically from improved cooking technology interventions. And as you can see here, there are about 20 papers that we found that estimate these time savings. And there's wide variation in the estimates of time savings that the studies find. Some of them are not statistical studies, which is why they don't have sort of confidence intervals around them. Others have very wide confidence intervals. Some of these studies only consider cooking time and don't consider fuel collection, or the opposite. And we had trouble finding consistent patterns based on the type of technology, the location of the study, or even the method that was applied in the research design that would explain the differences that you can find across these studies. But the point being that time savings could be large, and that the variation in these estimates is quite substantial. So then, sort of turning back to the motivation about sort of how this ties into gender, as I noted previously, the work that I'm presenting today falls within a broader discussion about the role of energy technology in poverty traps or virtuous cycles, especially as they relate to energy poverty. And so view one of that, which is the poverty trap view, says that use of traditional technologies and energy poverty imposes these air pollution, health burdens, as well as drudgery burdens very unequally, and that these contribute to gender inequality. This then, in turn, perpetuates energy poverty because the people who are most effective lack agency to sort of resolve the situation and break out of the trap. But a different view of this sort of flips the script, thinking through how improved energy access could work as a driver to reduce some of those energy poverty burdens, perhaps especially benefiting women, allowing them to sort of have more agency and then choose better technology and driving empowerment. So this is sort of another SETI collaborative study where led by Ipsita Das, who was at Duke for some time, which kind of looked at the evidence for this virtuous cycle in the literature and sort of framed that in the context of gender empowerment theories and how these different energy services could be linked to different measures of empowerment on the gender side, both political, social, as well as psychological, through various channels in terms of direct and indirect outcomes, as well as the reverse, which is that women who are more empowered might make different kinds of energy service choices as consumers and sort of drive adoption of cleaner technology, thereby sort of empowering the virtuous cycle. And so, in order to foster this virtuous cycle, there are a range of different interventions that are possible. One could come at this with household technology promotion, sort of bringing the improved energy technologies to households, promoting them, allowing labor-saving devices that reduce drudgery burdens. Infrastructure might play a role, so public investment either electrification or sort of better transport infrastructure, allowing people to access markets differently. Behavioral interventions that would provide information or marketing, coaching, gender empowerment sort of interventions that would sort of activate the second part of that cycle. Or, a variety of different policies. And all of these types of interventions are really about three main things in my view. One is potentially raising the perceived value of time, improving opportunities and agency, better internalizing benefits by sort of taking on this unequal bargaining power and allowing for different kind of decision-making within a household, or reducing costs of technology adoption through the form of price subsidies or sort of reducing information burdens. And estimating time savings and the value of time, as well as its drivers, are really a core part of understanding that logic. So that's kind of what we're after in this study. And just to briefly illustrate the policy relevance here, one can think of this as maybe powering something like an empowerment bond where people would be able to invest in these types of instruments that would lead these different benefits to be resolved. And this could be through a voluntary carbon market type of instrument, which is actually the type of instrument that Sequest Capital is using to finance cook stoves, because there are some mitigation benefits. So carbon finance is coming in there. But the voluntary part of this is to give that carbon some premium value because of the welfare benefits and development benefits that it provides as well. And by increasing the finance in this space, then you can sort of do more of this investment, distribute more technology, lower prices further, and thereby drive this virtuous cycle. So the final piece of this that I'll talk about in terms of motivation is value of time estimates that exist in the literature. And despite the importance of this parameter in benefit cost analysis, it's actually somewhat difficult to find values for low and middle income countries. Most of these values come from rich developed world country studies, and a lot of them come from the transportation sector. Dale Whittington and Joe Cook, I'm not sure if they're on, but they've been sort of instrumental in trying to characterize this literature and do reviews of the studies that provide these benefits. And not surprisingly, a lot of them come from water studies, water sector studies. In their review, there isn't a single estimate that comes from an energy application, including this kind of firewood sort of decision making. And there is an older literature in the forestry sector that focuses on shadow costs of firewood collection, which does a bit of this, but it generally doesn't directly estimate the value of time. It just sort of uses it as a parameter within models, or if it does estimate it, doesn't explicitly report on that in many of the studies. So we're going to be contributing estimates in that space. Okay, so moving on now to the specific study. Briefly on the intervention context here. So Sequest Capital is implementing this carbon finance plus type intervention financed through premium carbon that helps them distribute pretty simple technology that you can see here in this photo, which is more fuel efficient. They say it reduces fuel needs by anywhere from 30 to 50%. They have a time savings methodology that helps deliver these premium benefits that's been approved and certified by Vera, which is in this voluntary carbon space. And we are doing an impact evaluation of that promotion model in 4 different countries, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia, with the broader objective of trying to understand time use benefits, as well as gendered impacts in terms of empowerment benefits. And here's an overview of the broad evaluation design. We have sort of a baseline study where we do baseline surveys with about 4,000 households distributed roughly equally across those 4 countries. We have collected most of our end-line data, but we're cleaning a lot of it right now, so the end-line is not totally complete. In this paper, I'm going to primarily be using baseline data, except that I'll present some end-line results from a discrete choice experiment that we did to estimate the value of time. And largely we're examining either stated or revealed preference drivers of choice to purchase or collect firewood. The one country where the data collection is still ongoing, the data is incomplete for the DCE from, and that's Kenya. And as you can see from this diagram, we also have some household attrition, so the sample size shrinks a little bit in the end-line analysis. To tell you a little bit about the sample and what it looks like, here are some of those basic descriptives. We have about 4,000 studies at baseline across the 4 countries with complete data. All of these are rural households. They're somewhat similar on average across the 4 countries, except for some differences, like the fact that households look a little bit larger in Tanzania, have maybe more assets in Zambia. Many more have electricity in Kenya, and very few have electricity in Zambia. I do want to draw your attention particularly to the identity of the firewood collector. The primary firewood collector in these households tends to be, in the majority of households, the primary cook as well. And there are other adult females as well as children. And in the balance of this, it would be an adult male who is doing the firewood collection. So sometimes it is a male doing that activity. And then thinking about sort of important variables related to firewood sourcing and fuel use, a sizable share of these households are purchasing firewood, at least some of it, some of the time. But many of those are actually mixing purchase as well as collection. So it's important that households can actually do both of these things. That's going to be important for our econometric strategy. The reported fuel costs are lowest in Tanzania, where the most households report purchasing some fuel in this sample. The amounts of fuel purchased or collected also vary substantially in one kind of collection amount or one purchase amount. And there are some quite large outliers here for Tanzania, which, I'll come back to this issue because it could be due to reporting errors in the baseline data. Some of these are very high numbers, and we're kind of working on trying to sort through some of those outliers. Collection times, on the other hand, are highest in Malawi, where sort of it's more difficult to obtain firewood and biomass. And finally, in Kenya, you'll note that nearly half of the households use charcoal, but almost all of these households are using charcoal and firewood simultaneously. So they're not only using charcoal. Okay, so that's the sample description. Now let me turn briefly to the methods. So there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to try to be clear about exactly how we're analyzing the different data. But from a stated preference perspective, at baseline, we did a very simple one-time hypothetical exercise with households. The respondent was always the primary cook in these exercises. We did talk to the head of the household, who could be a different person in some cases, but not always, for some parts of the survey. But for the stated preference activities, it was always the primary cook. And that was the main respondent to the survey. So we gave them sort of a very simple kind of gamble to tell us, which of these sources they would prefer, where the only thing that was household specific in this gamble was the reported bundle price that they would have to pay. And the bundle was a standardized size of a bundle, which was about 2 kilograms per household. Then we sort of look at which option a household chose as a function of those prices that households face nearby for bundle prices, as well as a variety of household characteristics, which include respondent and household factors. Because there's limited variation here in terms of the time attributes that households show or express preference for, we can only do a bounding exercise on the value of time that relates sort of this bundle price to the time that would be saved. And that's going to be a pretty rough estimate, which we're going to then refine with a more detailed discrete choice experiment to conduct it at endline. So this was largely motivated by what we saw in those baseline surveys. And basically we came up with a discrete choice experiment where we randomized across different attributes: time, cost, quality of the fuel type, whether it was pure biomass like firewood or residues, which are the two main biomass sources, or charcoal, and then varied the season. Now note, the season was kept constant within a choice task, and each household did 4 choice tasks where they had to choose one of these 3 sources. Those sources were either collection, home delivery if there was no time associated with it, or purchase in the market. And both purchase in the market and collection could have a non-zero time associated with them. So each respondent did 4 of these choice tasks. These were from blocks that were randomized to the different households. And then each household had sort of 2 of these choice tasks per season, right? So we have dry and rainy season within each household. To estimate the value, the weights on those different preferences, we estimate a mixed logit regression where we allow this kind of stochastic disturbance term at the household level. We fix the cost coefficient and allow all of the other coefficients to vary with the normally distributed disturbance term. We also estimate a latent class logit where we can sort of look at different patterns of choices across different households and see if there are sort of distinct classes of households that are making different choices. And in these estimates, we get these coefficients on time and on prices, on costs, which we can take the ratio of to sort of get a value of time. And then finally, on revealed preferences, recall that I mentioned households can both purchase and collect, and sometimes they're doing both, and sometimes they're just doing one. So we're going to estimate a multi-equation model. There, we do both 2 equation models with just purchase or collect, as well as 3 equation models where the choice is between delivery, market, purchase, or collection from the environment. And in the 3 equation model, that potentially yields 3 different value of time estimates. In these equations, the costs are relative costs compared. So in the purchase options, it's compared to the collection option. And in the collection option, it's relative to the purchase. And similarly for time, they're relative time costs. The main problem with the RP estimates here are that these time and cost variables are actually endogenous, especially time, because households can change the quantities that they choose as a function of those prices. And that's going to sort of make this complicated to think about. So I don't have an easy solution for that endogeneity problem right away. We're going to try to control for quantity of fuel used. It also helps to break out the delivery versus the market, because we can have this distinct prices that are sort of set in the markets. But that notwithstanding, these time variables are also remain endogenous. So just to recap, we're going to estimate a series of either multi-equation models or multinomial logits to look at characteristics of different households. And then we're going to take the ratios of these coefficients to estimate the value of time across the different methods. All right. So with that, turning to the results. So starting with the very simple hypothetical gamble that households made at baseline. So recall that we're going to analyze that choice, collect, market, or home delivery in a multinomial logit framework. The omitted category here is collection from the environment, which is actually the majority of the sample choose that, about 60% of respondents. And just to highlight some of the important patterns here, these are all untransformed logit coefficients, so they're not marginal effects. But the price coefficients are negative. However, they are imprecise, not statistically significant here. Recall that I mentioned the identity of the fuel collector as being an object of interest in this research. So if that collector was the primary cook, we see that households are less likely to choose, or the respondent, which is the primary cook, is less likely to choose market purchase, as well as home delivery, but especially market purchase from that simple gamble. And then if the primary fuel collector is either adult female or a child, they're less likely to choose either of the purchasing options. Finally, wealthier households or households with more educated primary cooks are more likely to purchase either, home delivery or market purchase. And that's about as far as we take that sort of simple gamble from. So now we turn to the full DCE, and the results largely conform to expectations. Households are responding negatively to higher prices, higher time costs. They like higher quality fuel. They tend to like charcoal on average, and they have a somewhat of a distaste, all other factors being held constant, for the market, and a preference for collection from the environment. But there's a lot of heterogeneity here. So you can see the standard deviations on those disturbance terms are typically statistically significant, different from zero. And then there are some differences across countries, although the patterns largely follow the overall sample pattern. So for example, in Malawi, there's a subtle difference with less preference for charcoal, and perhaps less intrinsic difference across source types, right? Market, collection, or home delivery, in contrast to greater weights on all of those in the Tanzanian sample. And similarly, if you look at Zambia and half of the Kenya sample, we kind of see some subtle differences. Zambia, again, sort of less distaste or dispreference for the market, and Kenya slightly less of a focus on or preference for charcoal, which is interesting given that many more users of charcoal in Kenya. And partly, though, this could be explained by heterogeneity on that charcoal preference, because there seem to be some households that put a lot of weight on that and other households that put much less weight in Kenya, where charcoal is widely available. And so perhaps explaining a little bit of that dichotomy of, some households don't use charcoal at all, even though it's available, because they prefer firewood. So turning to the value of time from these stated preferences, recall from the bounding exercise, we don't get all that much information. You can see the share that opted for collection versus purchase from the market versus home delivery, and that simple gamble in the percentage that's in parentheses. But here in terms of the intuition, we can sort of compare the value of time as less than two lower bounds for those who choose collection from the environment, because we know that the value they place is less than the cost of either the purchase or the home delivery option, but we don't know how much less. And similarly for home delivery, we know that the value they place is greater than sort of the time cost that's implied by those other two options, the market or collection, but we don't know how much higher. So that's why we have these kind of inequalities here. But we can estimate those much more precisely with the discrete choice experiment. And overall, we're finding sort of value of time that's about 30 to 45% in the full sample from the DCE. Varies a little bit across countries, slightly higher perhaps in Tanzania and Kenya overall, but in the same general ballpark. And the wage rates are similar across the 4 countries as well in our sample. When we do the latent class analysis, though, to look a little bit more at the within sample heterogeneity, if there are different sort of categories of households that choose different options, we can see considerable heterogeneity, and particularly the best sort of model that's most intuitive and sort of has the best statistical fit is a 4-class model, where there is a minor share of households in this class 4, which has a relatively high value of time that's implied at about the market wage. And this tends to be the group when we look at sort of the determinants of that that class membership, we see that that group is actually the one that's much less likely to collect and choose home delivery. They tend to be wealthier. They often have children who are collecting, so they're smaller households. So that, they particularly maybe want to avoid children collecting fuel. And they have more empowered primary cooks in general in terms of decision-making power for minor household purchasing decisions. On the other hand, sort of the comparison class, which is the largest class, which is a third of the sample here, tends to be a poorer class of households with less empowered primary cooks relative to the other classes. All right. So finally, the revealed preference results, and this is just one of the models. I could show you a number of these, but I'm going to focus on this one because I think it illustrates pretty well the different patterns in the samples. So this is a 3-equation model allowing for correlation across these 3 choices: delivery, market purchase, or collection. And we can see that as the price of the firewood for a given option is increasing, households are less likely to choose delivery and the market purchase. And those are the market price or the delivery price. And if they save more time from purchasing, they're also more likely to choose home delivery. There's a negative sign on this for the market, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But a lot of the people purchasing in the market are also collecting at the same time. So we're kind of working on unpacking that further. And then similarly, if the prices go up, households are more likely to collect from the environment. And if they save more time, they're less likely to collect from the environment because they save more time by purchasing. There are some other interesting patterns here, but let's focus maybe on the fuel identity, the identities of the firewood collectors. We see that households that have a primary firewood collector who's a cook or an adult female or a child are more likely to collect in the first place. And for the 2 latter categories, particularly less likely to purchase from market and choose home delivery. And then finally, wealthier households appear more likely to purchase with home delivery in particular. And more educated primary cooks are less likely to be in households that are collecting fuel. Okay. What do we get for value of time estimates? These are a little bit unstable across different specifications, which might be due to some of the endogeneity of the time and price variables. But if we focus particularly on 3 countries where the estimates tend to be a little bit more stable, which is excluding Tanzania, that was the country also where we have these very large quantities, which seem to also affect our implied time and price estimates per kilogram. We see sort of estimates that are kind of within the same ballpark of what we get from the stated preference analysis. So value of time that's between 20 and 67% of the market wage rate. So this is just the overall summary again, and focusing in the full sample for revealed preference on those 3 countries that are most stable. The bounding exercise looks like the estimates are higher, but remember, these are just kind of bounds and they're relatively imprecise. That home delivery group, we know from the DCE and the latent class analysis that that group tends to have a higher value of time. So it's not completely out of the ballpark of those higher estimates. And so in general, the results are largely consistent, but there is some variation across according to different subsamples within the household across countries, and then some instability across different methods. Okay, so I'm just about out of time watching the clock, but maybe just a couple of minutes for brief recap and discussion. So, basically to conclude, households do appear in these samples to be making trade-offs between time and money, but that doesn't seem to be the only thing that matters. From some of the additional analyses that we do, we also see within sample heterogeneity in those choice patterns that partly reflect constraints and opportunities, the identity of the fuel collector, the wealth of the household, the empowerment of the primary cook, and so forth. And the implied value of time accordingly varies considerably and sort of reflects these opportunities. The upshot is that it looks like a value that varies between about a quarter of the wage and the full wage rate. Seems to be consistent with this sample. Those higher estimates are really a minority of the households in the sample. And most households are probably more like between 25% and half of the market wage rate. And a minority of households that have these high implied values are the ones that we see really purchasing, valuing, putting a premium on the time by choosing for home delivery of fuel. So, next steps is to gather feedback on this. I hope to hear lots of interesting questions and points, unpack the heterogeneity a bit further, investigate some of these data anomalies, particularly that have to do with some of the outlier values, and then incorporate the full set of data from the N-line study so that we can also see how the intervention may or may not have changed the value of time according to sort of changing some of these constraints within the sample. So with that, I will stop. Thanks for listening and for joining today. I hope that I've not abused of your time. Open it up for questions. Marcela, over to you. Thanks.
Yes, many thanks, Marc, for this wonderful presentation. It was a really good work with a substantial amount of work working simultaneously in these 4 countries. After saying so, I would like to give the word to the public. I have one question on the chat. This question is by Gunnar. And the question is about literature. He asked in which category of the literature review comes time savings when it comes to improve supply.
Marcela, can I elaborate on it instead? I mean, that's a very nerdy kind of question. Well, first of all, thank you, Marc. As you know, this was a couple of years in the 90s. This was my only preoccupation. This is amazing that you're back to this, because of course what we know very well is that time is, particularly for those who don't have a lot of land, time is the only thing they have, right? So of course this has value, and that the whole, much of the development economics literature has not looked into that. It's just a shame. So I really, really appreciate the focus that you give to the value of time of these households. But even so, well, first of all, just to emphasize your overall finding. I mean, what I found then, 30 years ago too, is that these households are incredibly sensitive to relative prices. And what you're starting to tease out here is, of course, I mean, not only between collection, roughly, and market. I mean, these are multiple energy markets and multiple collection opportunities, right? And so what I found way back then, and I think that when you unpack this, what you will find too is that if you look into those 2 categories, you will find more margins that they are equating, and so that kind of marginal productivity that they have, and in various kinds of collections, it's amazing how they actually optimize that. So I think that you're onto something very important there that needs to be looked into in very many different contexts. Then we come to my question on kind of the supply side, and I also when I was feeling that even stronger when you came to these virtuous cycles of interventions, because I think historically a lot of interventions, right or wrong, a lot of the interventions have been on the supply side. You know, in my case, it was village woodlots, but you have a lot of, I mean, what we stumbled across in Tanzania that you were part of was this ethanol thing, right? And there are briquettes and this and that. So, and now we have these huge interventions for Africa on various kinds of afforestation, reforestation, greening belts, and what have you, right? So a lot of things, and to a certain extent, you did pick up on that, of course, when you ask, you know, when you look at the time, for example, or the price. But I think to also in your introduction to give credit to that is where a lot of the kind of intervention action is. I think that would kind of strengthen also then your analysis when you are, you know, to which extent does this actually tally with people's preferences and, you know, the potential for these interventions. But overall, Marc, you know, I love this work, and I'm so excited that you're putting so much time and attention and resources into looking at this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gunnar. I completely agree with the general comment. I don't think it's as much a question as it is a comment. I think, you know, just to emphasize this point about the margins, multiple margins, it's, you know, both in terms of like how they combine different options. It's also who does it in the household, because multiple people are often collecting firewood, even though there's a primary firewood collector in many cases. It's about complementarities in that activity with sort of other activities like livestock rearing or farming, because households that are using crop residues, it's sort of complementary with agriculture in some ways. But there are so many different margins, at least on the, and that's what makes the revealed preference aspect of this analysis a bit challenging, frankly, compared to, you know, the stated preference analysis, which is much cleaner, but, you know, sort of has the usual caveats associated with these, you know, are sort of hypothetical constructed choices. But I do, you know, think that the fact that we have both of these approaches within the study also is useful in terms of looking at convergent validity of the estimates as well. But yeah, completely agree with the comments. Thanks.
Perfect. We have still some minutes for additional questions. Does anyone want to raise a question? Otherwise, I will go to the chat. Okay, in the meantime, I will go for another question, and it's about the research methods. Why did you use a difference indifference instead of a single meal difference? It is not that an RCT?
Yeah, I see that's from iPhone. I don't know who iPhone is, but but it's a great question. So and just to be clear, in this particular paper, we don't do any of the diff and diff. That's going to be the larger impact evaluation. But it's not really a pure RCT because we're following the implementation model of Sequest Capital. And so we kind of discussed with them exactly how they would do the intervention. I would say it's sort of quasi-randomized, but it's not randomized in a true like randomization sense. And it turns out that as we sort of move forward with the full analysis of this intervention, there's also a lot of messiness in that implementation. So the diff and diff is going to be a lot more useful, both because a lot of households in the supposed intervention zones didn't adopt. And so, you know, we would be in the ITT sort of world, but then we lose a lot of power on the estimates. And because it's not sort of purely randomized, it's kind of a stretch to make an instrument argument that the treatment assignment is really robust. But also, you know, there were just, you know, sort of other complications in the intervention that mean that the diff and diff is particularly important. And so we're, you know, in the larger evaluation project, there's going to be a lot more discussion of how to do the econometrics and deal with, you know, who was treated versus who was not, and how to make these kinds of assessments, as well as, checking balance in the groups. But it's not a pure RCT. Yeah.
Okay, and while I ask a participant to raise further questions, I want to take advantage of my role as moderator to ask you a question, Marc. And my question is about heterogeneity. As you mentioned at the very end of your presentation, there is a great deal of heterogeneity, and there is always be a huge heterogeneity when we are working on one particular setting. And here you have 4 countries. And my question relates specifically to the latent class models. This is a very good way of capturing this heterogeneity, but it will be interesting to at least to have more information on what are the characteristics of households on each class, and where this class determined endogenously by the model, how stable they are when it comes to do the same characteristics holding in one question, also hold for the different countries, or for this ample range of individuals, should we like how to think and rethink who is on each class, so that's to gather this heterogeneity, or to get to understand a bit more that heterogeneity, and the extent to which characteristics such as empowerment and gender plays a role to be part in one of particular classes. And my question is because like these classes are powerful enough to inform potential mechanisms to gather a specific type of individuals to adopt.
Yeah. So thanks, Marcela. Just to clarify a couple of things, because I went through that pretty quickly. But yes, we estimate the model endogenously based purely on the choice patterns. So not putting any household characteristics in that sort of first class estimation. And then from those choice patterns, what I've done afterwards, which is sort of summarized in those notes at the bottom of this slide that's shown here, is run a multinomial logit, which sort of looks at household and respondent characteristics that correlate with different class assignments for households. And that's how we know, for example, that class 4 is these people who are much less likely to be collecting firewood. They tend to be wealthier and so forth. But these other sort of classes also have interesting features to them. I didn't have time to go through the full set of things. But what I haven't done, which relates to your question, is estimate different classes for different countries. This is only on the overall pooled sample. What I suspect will happen with different countries is that maybe there'll be slightly different numbers of classes, but perhaps fewer classes in some countries, because in some places we see very little purchase actually happening, right? So there's going to be more consistent patterns of choices, I think, and it's a good suggestion to try that estimation. Some of those models tend to be hard to estimate, so we may be constrained by sample size to some degree when we cut this into different countries, but I will try it. And thanks for the question.
Okay, perfect. And we have 3 brief questions in the chat. The first one is about what is the cost of 1 hour of the people of there? Also, how this varies respect to the hour dedicated if a person work? This is a question from Peru. And another question, are you aware of any study looking at the value of time and water collection? And the third one is a clarification question when it comes to the meaning of women agency in the current setting.
Right. Okay. So three great, the first two are relatively straightforward. The last one I'll maybe say a little bit more about. So yes, definitely aware of these studies looking at the value of time from water. That's some of the literature that I referred to that Cook and Whittington had reviewed in their guidance papers. And that's where most of this value of time work in low and middle income countries has been done, actually, in contrast to developed countries where it's a lot from the transportation choice sector. And then, in terms of the cost of 1 hour of time, that's what we're trying to estimate in some, so this value of time, really. And so I put this slide back up that has at least just our stated preference estimates to show you also what the average wage rate is in our sample in these different locations. And those average wage rates are actually fairly similar across the 4 samples. But the sort of value of time is a fraction of that. And that, partly reflects the fact that a lot of people aren't in the labor market, so they're not making a trade-off between paid labor and this time that they're spending on firewood collection. But, for some of these households, it tends to come closer to that average wage rate. And then finally, the last question, Damala, this is a great question about women's agency and intersectionality implications. So what I would say is that, one of the things that we're interested in particular, especially thinking back to that virtuous cycle issue, is that, and also hearkening back to Gunnar's point about like lots of supply side interventions, but maybe an intervention here would be to actually empower women within the household to raise that value of time, and also sort of change the way households are making these trade-offs between time and fuel. So that definitely has intersectionality implications for the value of time, and opens up a whole new set of potential interventions here that have nothing to do with the energy problem right away, right? So, but they're sort of trying to activate that other side of the intervention space. And we have rich data on women's time use agency as well as decision-making power from this survey that we've kind of scarcely exploited here in this analysis, but that's quite relevant to these questions. Hopefully that answers your question, Damala.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, Marc, for your great presentation, for this great job. I hope we can see a bit more of the results in the future. And having said so, we finalize our first seminar, and I invite all the assistants to celebrate Marc with an applause. So
thanks
thank you very
for
much
having
all.
me, and thanks for hosting, Marcela. Appreciate it.